And with me now is Michael Swanwick. Michael, welcome back to Fast Forward.
Thank you very much.
Now, your new book, your latest book, is Dragons of Babel, and that's come out from Tor just now as we speak. And fascinating book. Now, talk about the world of this for a little bit. It's the same world as Iron Dragon's daughter, right?
I decided eventually, I wrote half the book and not knowing whether it was the same world or not. I knew the dragons were the same, but there were no characters in common. There were no geographic features or even gods in common. And it could have been a different world. And I could not decide whether it was or not. And finally, halfway through, 3/4 of the way through, I decided that it did not do it any harm to be in the same world. And some people who had read the first book might like that. So I made that decision. I took a character from the first book and let her do a cameo in the second book. And she makes a brief appearance, almost kills the protagonist, and then leaves. So,
and it's a fascinating world. The cover and everything makes it look fantasy, and it is fantasy, but it's a mechanized fantasy. I mean, the dragons are fascinating. They're metal, they have afterburners, they have pilots.
it's a 20th century, 21st century fairy. I figured that they had moved with the times. And when I wrote my first fantasy, Iron Dragon's Daughter, what happened then was I had been in Ireland in 1982, the first time I'd ever been overseas. And everywhere I went, you saw castles and stone rings and ruins of crofters' huts. And they were all things that you grew up reading about all your life but had never seen before. And every one of them looked and felt different from how I had imagined it would be. And we were taking a picture of an old ring fort, the ruins of an old ring fort. There's a sign up that said, identified as a fairy ring. And this 10-year-old boy came out of a house and saw us taking these pictures and said, well, what are you doing here? And my wife said, so we're taking pictures of the fairy ring. And he said, don't tell me you still believe in fairies. And it struck me then, that the kids in the British Isles grow up with these things literally in their backyards. And the kids in the United States grew up reading about these things. So it seemed to me then that I was never going to be able to write a major fantasy novel because this wasn't my heritage. And then I came up with the idea of setting it in a modern fairy. And all of a sudden, I could put in shopping malls, I could put in junkyards, I could put in strip joints, I could put in things that came out of my world and my experience. And so I proceeded to do that.
Yeah, and it's delightful when these things drop in every once in a while. They'll sit there and they'll get a liter of Pepsi. Esme, one of the characters we'll talk about a little later, is on the train. She turns on her transistor radio to listen to Duke Ellington.
That was an amazing moment for me because in the first book that didn't happen. In the first book I was very careful to any references to our world were visionary. And in this book that caught me by surprise when all of a sudden she turned on the radio and it was Duke Ellington. It was kind of a magic moment for me. I had no idea what it meant. I knew it was important. I thought, well, maybe the reader will like it too.
Well, this one did.
Thank you.
Now, the story in the book is about Will. And it begins with Will in his small town. It's kind of, the first part is almost a coming of age.
Oh, very much so. He's in a small town east of Avalon. And he's out in the country. It's a bucolic little fantasy existence that he's leading. And then the war comes through. And it's very much as if you were having, in a small village in Vietnam when the war came through, or in Afghanistan or anywhere. Things got very bad.
Right, and he's watching the dragon go by, but the dragon is basically a jet fighter.
Yes. Yes, they're built to kill, and they're very evil devices.
And so, there is a dragon ends up in his village of sorts. And he
declares himself the king.
Yes.
He explains that he is now the ruler of the village, and that if they disobey him or turn him in, that he'll ignite the fuel tanks and just blow the village off the face of the earth.
And they have to recharge his batteries.
Yes.
because
Because he's in bad
this is the
shape.
Swanwickian fantasy world. So the dragons need their batteries recharged and things like that, and he takes Will as his, I guess,
His lieutenant.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, it's Will does some bad things in the dragon's service, and they're not his fault. He's a child. He has no control over what happens. Nevertheless, he does bad things, and afterwards he has to come to terms with that. And that's what a great deal of the book is about. It's an imperfect world. There are a lot of things wrong with it. And he has to, as he grows up, he has to decide what he is going to do about that.
Right, and he does his travels as he's forced to leave the village.
Yes, he's forced out of the village, again, not his fault. He becomes
Right.
a refugee.
Right.
He travels across the land that is at war, and eventually he ends up in Babel. Now, this is an old pattern. You know, I started reading fantasy with Lord of the Rings, something like in 1966, and back then, there was only so much fantasy you could read, and I proceeded to read all of it in a very short period. And at that time, the fantasy novels were were not only rare, but very different from each other. And it took a good 10 years after after Lord of the Rings became a big hit, for people to figure out how to replicate it and make imitation Lord of the Ring novels. And nowadays, it's down to a formula. I'm sure that somewhere you can buy fantasy novels for idiots, and it will explain to you that you take an attractive young person from out in the country somewhere. This person is secretly the one true king and doesn't know it. He's going to go off on a quest, and at the end, he'll be restored to the throne. And the problem with this is that I am a Democrat, small d, and I am not a monarchist. I don't see the restoration of the king as being a good thing. I think you should take and throw the king out the window. I'm much happier with our flawed democratic process than I would be with a monarch. So there's a basic problem with these kind of fantasies that are all yearning toward a bucolic past that didn't exist.
And this shows in this book. That whole attitude of yours is all through this book, and particularly as we get into Babel. And what's fascinating to me, one of the fascinating things to me in the book is there's different kinds of books in this book. You've got the prisoner of war. You got the camp, displaced persons camp story in it. You've got a locked room mystery. You've got the rebellion going on. You've got the big con game book going on in this. And I love the way all those threads all wove together to make a nice rope.
They were all things that Will had to learn. Will had to, through the book, grow and become an adult and become the kind of adult who could make an adult decision at the end, and an informed decision. So he needed to have a lot of experiences. He needed to learn his world. And of course, he needed to be the kind of character who, in the course of learning his world, could teach his world to us. Really, that's what basically all novels do. This one, perhaps, a little more obviously than some.
Now, one of the characters, I want to talk a bit about some of the other characters in the book, because they're delightful. As he travels, he meets Esme.
Yes.
Who is a little girl, kinda.
Yes.
And
She's
a lucky little girl.
She has extraordinary luck. She has kind of luck that benefits herself and no one else. And Esme does not have. She has a smaller part in the book than you would think, although she's pivotal to it. But she's a scene stealer. She comes in and just walks away with the book. Anytime that she's on, she's really where your attention is. She's just one of those characters, just one of those people.
Yeah, she comes in and out. And then we have Nat Wilk,
Yes.
who is met on the long train journey to Babel. And Nat has his own story in there, and he's a fascinating character.
And Nat has a special relationship with the truth.
Yes.
And which is perhaps a little less obvious than may seem. Like any good con man, he knows that you keep your lies simple, and essentially he just never lies. But he presents the truth in such an unreliable way that people assume he's lying, and therefore he breezes right through life. Nat's name, incidentally, is Anglo-Saxon for no man. And it was an old pen name of C.S. Lewis.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yes.
So we have him, we have Lord Weary, who is the rebellion underground with Hjordis.
Yes.
I don't know how to describe Lord Weary.
Oh, Lord Weary. Actually, Lord Weary is based on somebody I knew. And he was the most cynical individual I ever knew. And he thought that everything was crap. Just nothing was of any value or worth whatsoever. And you were inferior to him because you didn't realize this. But he knew that nothing was worth anything, and this made him worth more than you. Really,
yeah.
I despise this person, but he made a good character.
He's a
So I
great
finally
character.
got some use out of him.
Great character. And then there's Hjordis, also underground. This is like in the subways, in the underground, under Babel, which is reminded me of Manhattan in a way, of New York.
Well, actually, I did a lot of research into the. There are a lot of people living in the subways under Manhattan, and anywhere there's a subway system, there are people living in the back tunnels, in the drop ceilings of the bathrooms, in the strangest place, and that's where the broken people go. That's where the people go who cannot make it on the surface, who cannot haven't got it together, sleep in a cardboard box, and there are books about this. There are at least thousands of people living under New York City. And they have small communities, and they have leaders. And Hjordis is very typical of what a leader of a community under the subway system is like, apparently.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's fascinating. But we have to talk about Alcyone. She shows up, well, kind of at the beginning of Babylon, and then really shows up later on as the con gets going. And she's amazing.
She's the love interest,
Yeah.
and I tried to make her everything that the romantic interest in a fantasy novel never is. She's got a life of her own.
Mm-hmm.
She's got a great deal of strength, a great deal of power, and she's not interested in having an affair with Will, which only makes him all that more determined, of course. I liked her a lot. I especially liked the fact that in her day-to-day life she runs things. She has an important part in the city of Babel.
With signs and portents, I believe.
Signs and portents. But what she
The Bureau
wants,
of Signs.
yeah. And then there's this other side of her. What she wants to be is she wants to be a swashbuckler, an adventurer, a fantasy hero. And in her free time, she is. But she knows that you can't do that in the real world. In the real world, you've got to get up in the morning and go back to the office. So she does that too.
Yes, and I love the scene at the ball where they meet and all this stuff goes on, and Will is just sure that this is, he's going to get lucky with her, and it turns out quite different.
Yes,
that's a scene that made me laugh.
well, because of the way things were set up, she was the only woman there he couldn't have had. Everybody else is convinced that he's somebody he's
Yes.
not, and all the women there were desperate to score him, as it were. And the only woman he wants will not have him, and it was important. They could not come together under false pretenses and have it work as a romance.
It's great. Before we run out of time, we're getting a little low. I want to talk a little bit about the blog that you had that I understand you were forced to do.
I was directed
To do it. It's called Flogging Babel. And one of the things you do in it is you show diagrams that you had done while you were in the process of writing the book.
Yes.
And that was absolutely fascinating to me, particularly to go back afterwards and look at it. Now, so the diagramming is something that you carefully do to work out how things are going to happen in the novel?
Yes, well, sometimes when the writing was going well and easily, I just did not. But whenever it was going slow and I was having a hard time working it out, I'd do little diagrams. You draw a line and diagonal across the page, and that's the main character, the protagonist, Will. He's always there, so that's him. And then you have a line come in from the side, that's another character. Say it's Nat Wilk, and runs along him for a while when they're together, and then goes off when he goes somewhere else, and comes back like that. And you have kind of a waving line for somebody just recurs now and again. And when you draw these out, and you begin to realize that the way that you're imagining them moving around, that you have them popping in and out of doors all the time. You've got to simplify that. You've got to find a way to make the same things happen in fewer encounters. And it also reminds you that when that character is off the page, and nobody's even thinking about that character's still off there doing something. And it's helpful for you to have an idea of how long that character's away and what he or she might be doing in the meantime.
So it is for me, it was fascinating to see. Plus, there's some delightful other things on the blog as well. We're getting short on time. Let's talk a little bit about what's next. You're still doing all the short fiction, which I think is some of the best around. Your short fiction is, so I think some of the best we've got. But you started, I believe, on a new novel.
I have started writing a new novel. It's going to take a while to write. I'm only one chapter in. But it's the adventures of Dargar and Surplus, who are my post-utopian con men. They first popped up in a story called The Dog Said Bow Wow. And at the end of the story, they accidentally set fire to London and had to leave. And as they're leaving, Surplus looks back and says, Surplus is a dog who's been genetically modified into human form, but he's still recognized to be a dog. And he looks back at London burning and says, I cannot help but feel partially responsible. And Dargar says, London's burned before, and it'll burn again. Lift up your hearts, and we're going off to Paris now, and then we'll go off to Russia, to Moscow. They have these plans for a big heist. And I've written a few more stories. I have many stories in mind. And at the end of each story, they set off confidently for some place, and in the beginning of the next story, they pop up somewhere else because they're infinitely distractible. And I figured that eventually they would reach Moscow, and that when they reached Moscow, it would be it would deserve an entire novel. And when I finished this, The Dragons of Babel, I said, I was casting around for what to write next. And I said, that's the best book I have in mind, so I'll just write that one. And so I went to Moscow for a couple of weeks to research the novel.
Great.
Yeah, I'd been there 4 hours before once. And I figured that wasn't enough time.
Yep. Well, that sounds like it's fun. The stories are delightful. I'm looking forward to it. I'm afraid we're out of time, unfortunately. So much more we could talk about, and hopefully you'll be back again.
Well, be happy to.
Well, thank you for coming.
Well, thank you for having me.
For all of us here at Fast Forward, this is Mike Zipser saying, take care.